them, yeah. Were you Special call meeting for February 27th. We'll call the meeting to order. We have quorum, and one trustee may join us in a few minutes on Zoom. But before we begin our agenda, I'd like to call for a moment of silence for our student that we lost. Thank you. Thank you. Let's stand for our pledge to both flags. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Under public forum, we have two people that have signed up to speak. I have Laura Nunn, who wants to talk about the ballot propositions for May 6th, uniform election. You could come up to the podium, please.
Good evening, trustees. First, I want to thank you for your service to the schools, and thank you for allowing me to address you this evening. My name is Laura Nunn. I chose to retire to San Marcos, Texas in 2020. Before leaving the Rio Grande Valley, where I was born and raised, and since arriving in San Marcos, I have become aware of some alarming spending practices being conducted by school boards in Hays County, among which is the San Marcos Consolidated Independent School District. In researching the bonds that will be on our ballots for the upcoming uniform election on May 6th, I discovered that the board wishes to meet the state's requirement to reduce its wealth by purchasing attendance credits, quote, as a means to equalize wealth pursuant to Chapter 49 of the Texas Education Code. Nowhere in the order for the election do I find how much you intend to spend on these attendance credits. Don't you have a fiduciary responsibility to the voters to disclose just how much wealth is to be redistributed back to the Texas Education Agency? How can a voter know whether your proposal is aligned with Chapter 49 of the Education Code if the voter doesn't have all of the facts? The facts the voter needs include the total amount proposed to be spent purchasing these attendance credits, the terms of the bond, such as the length of time to pay off the bond and the interest rate, as you did include in the three propositions that will also be on the ballot for nearly $150 million for buildings and buses, nearly $1 million for the high school stadium, and finally over $17 million for a natatorium. The questions that need to be answered before voting on these propositions are as follows. Number one, where can a voter locate the justifications and rationale for these bonds? Number two, where can a voter locate the detailed master plan for these four propositions? And number three, has the district made any attempt to contract the use of an existing swim facility? Why does the school district need its own indoor pool? In summary, the so-called excess wealth pronounced by the state on San Marcos Consolidated Independent School District should be returned directly to the taxpayers. The existence of this wealth clearly indicates that properties have been overvalued. The Hays County Central Appraisal District is actively harming property owners by inflating property values to the extent that school districts generate unlawful profit. Going forward, I will work with my legislators to find a way to return any so-called excess wealth directly to the taxpayers. I humbly suggest you do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Second speaker, Rodrigo Amaya, accountability.
Board, trustees, thank you to that previous speaker. Once again, accountability, folks. These manufactured crises that y'all have created by placing folks in positions like safety. You know, I come in here, I see everybody pretty nice and excited and happy. We just lost a child, you know, that's not anything to be happy about. The response from this superintendent here, or whoever's idea was to wear purple in support, that's pretty nice, but that's it. Some things to think about as far as safety and accountability. Got a call about a bus driver that fell asleep twice and wrecked a school bus with students on board. Okay, clearly the transportation director y'all have placed there is not cutting it. This is not the first time this has happened. This has repeatedly happened. I was there in 2011 as a driver. I brought this issue up because a lot of the bus drivers were going and doing secondary employment, and then they were getting off and coming and working. I know they need money, but to risk children like that, it's unacceptable. A lot of these folks were my friends, and I had to talk to them about it. That's not my job. You know, former trustees, I invited them to discuss issues that I clearly witnessed myself, and nobody seemed to do anything about it. How many children do we have to lose before y'all start putting folks that are qualified? And I got a big problem with Wozniak, I mean, the director for safety.
We don't mention names.
Yeah,
but
well,
please.
I mean, you know, this guy to get the training from YouTube videos, I mean, that's not gonna cut it, folks. We got school shootings, Uvalde, I was there for 2 years when I was younger. I mean, this is just, it's gonna happen again. And again, it all starts here with this board. This example of allowing trustees to, you know, be out partying and getting arrested and there's no consequences and stuff like that. That standard's gotta go, folks. You know, I'm sorry if y'all get tired of me and other folks coming up here and addressing y'all about this stuff. It's not gonna go away until y'all do what needs to be done. Okay, it starts with putting the right superintendent in place. We do not have that. It's repeatedly been seen and seen and seen and seen. When y'all gonna do the right thing? Get rid of the superintendent as soon as you can. Bring somebody in here that really is gonna make a difference and really puts our kids first. That's not what's happening. And y'all can sit here and lie all you want and pretend it and mask it like y'all care. Your actions clearly tell me otherwise. So please do a better job sooner than later, because, you know, this stuff about this bus driver that wrecked twice, I got a call about it. I mean, where's the director from transportation who addresses it? What's he doing about it? Have y'all been told about it? Probably don't even know about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
President Cantu, could I
Yes.
take a point of privilege?
Yes.
I would like to thank the Superintendent Cardona, Mr. Wozniak, all the members of the cabinet, the administration, all the teachers, the staff, and the students and the parents at Goodnight Middle School, as well as the high school and all of our campuses, for their professionalism, their extraordinary actions, their competency during this extraordinarily horrible and tragic event that has broken all of our hearts. Thank you.
You're here. I think all the board would agree that we're very grateful to our administration, staff, teachers, all the responses from everyone associated with SMCISD, and of course with our leadership. Thank you. Let's start with the agenda preparation for March 6th.
Madam President, members of the board, we will have some student recognitions that we had to postpone until this coming month for UIL and other activities for high school students, and also for our middle school students who have been participating in UIL competitions. Item 6, closed session, as authorized by section 551.071, 551.082, 551.0821, and 551.074 of the Texas Education Code. A, we conduct a level 3 hearing of a parent-student grievance pursuant to board policy F&G local. Item 7, open session, the board will reconvene from closed session to take action if necessary on item discussed in closed session. A, action regarding level 3 hearing filed by parent student pursuant to the board policy F&G local. Item 8, reports and information items. Item 8A, academics. We will do our taper report, which we moved from last month. Item B, operations, we will have an operations update. Item C, finance. Finance Department will present the quarterly financial report, item 1, and the quarterly investment report. Item 8D, the Board of Trustees, we will have an update by the redistricting committee on single-member district redistricting plans. Item 9, approval of consent agenda items. Item 9A, approval of minutes of regular scheduled board meeting on February 13, 2023. Special board meeting on February 27, 2023. Item 10, items for action. Item 10A, communications. We will present, consider approval of District of Innovation and have information for y'all at that time. Item 10A2, consider approval of the 2023-2024 school calendar. Mr. Fernandez will be here to answer any questions. Item 10B, elections, consider cancellation of school board trustees election for single-member District 3. Item,
I have a question on that. Don't we have to go through with the election because it's not an incumbent? I think we need to check on that. Because that person has never been officially elected.
I'm sorry.
For the single-member District 3, even though that candidate is running unopposed, I think we probably still have to go forward with the election because that person has not been actually elected by the constituents. Otherwise, it would be an appointment, I would think.
But we're just canceling the single member District 3. We're not canceling the election for the trustees. So we need to do the cancellation, so whenever it comes for the polling locations, then that certificate is gonna be posted in every single location. So the counties, they have to have that certificate, that it has been canceled, that election. So in case somebody's going to vote for the single member District 3, they will know that they are not.
But that's what I'm saying. Are we sure that we can do that? Because that candidate has never been elected. So if we don't go through with an election, even though they're the only person on the ballot, that seems,
But you did the order, you called the order, you did the election, you called the order for the election for the all 3 members. So now we have to cancel, that's what we normally do every year.
Ms. Cantu?
Elections for the single member districts, we cancel that, and then they will not take place on the seat until May.
okay,
So it's just to cancel that particular.
okay,
but we'll get further clarification.
Okay.
And I can check, but, I mean, because I know that the counties are already expecting that information from
Okay.
from us.
I know, Alicia, you've studied that real carefully and are giving us the proper information on it.
Item
Continue.
10C, discussion and possible action allowing for the implementation of the school marshal program. Item 10D, finance, consider approval of budget amendments.
And it's just a change from function to function, it's not taken out of the balance.
Madam President, that's all I have for agenda.
Okay. Mr. Shanks?
For item C, the safety, can we get before the next meeting, can we get a cost estimate of what that program is going to cost us? You know, we haven't seen any numbers on it, so before we can even have a true discussion about it, we need to know what the cost.
What's it gonna cost?
the estimated
My
costs
understanding
are.
would be the first person is already on board, so you would have to consider that person, so there's not a cost until we actually
Hire someone.
recommend other.
So maybe then a plan
We'll
of
get
what
you
it's
the-
gonna look like at 1, 3, and 5 years?
Correct.
Cost basis. That way we have something to discuss.
And the number that are being, the number of marshals that are being recommended.
also, I mean, I think in the cost analysis, we should include the costs that we're already incurring to cover the additional campuses that the Marshall program would begin to cover. So I would assume that in the first year or two, we would actually have fewer expenses. But I think seeing that analysis would be helpful.
Mr. Redondo, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Cantu. My question in regards to Mr. Shanks's information request is, can we also get like a side-by-side budget breakdown of what our current safety expenses are? I know we currently operate two separate programs. One of them being the SRO program, and then the other being the private security firm that we contract out with. So
Are
what
you
are the
asking
current
for
costs of this effort? Would
all
be
costs
first
associated with safety?
Yes.
Okay.
Current expenditures and then future expenditures.
Safety personnel, I think, not.
Correct.
We don't need to know about crossing.
Correct, yes.
Anyone else?
Just to further clarify, my request is cost for what I guess arguably would be what the school marshals would be replacing, right? I don't, at least based on a number of factors, I don't think it's in addition to what we're currently doing, but instead of, if we were to move in this direction. So,
Okay.
Yes.
thank you.
Great. Anyone else? Okay, then, are we ready to go into our workshop?
Ms. Cantu, I have one item, maybe. Is that okay if I speak, or?
He says he wants to add an item.
You want to add an item to the agenda? Please go ahead.
So if one of my colleagues wants to sponsor this item to help me out, I'd appreciate it. But based on one of the public commenters this evening, I guess I'm interested in seeing if there's interest from this board in passing a resolution asking the legislature to increase basic allotment for school districts in Texas, because that would, in essence, let San Marcos CISD and all school districts in Texas keep more of their money, although I disagree with some of the comments that were made in regards to the ISD profiting from this current system, because if you look at our budget, I don't think we are profiting in any form or fashion. But on the point of asking the legislature to do more, I couldn't agree more. So I'm happy to sponsor it, but obviously I think it would look better if it didn't come from me. But
I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
thank you, Ms. Halsey.
I would also like to officially request that we put forward a commendation of our administration, of our teachers, our staff, our students, our community, and our first responders, especially in appreciation and acknowledgement of their service and dedication to our community.
I think that's a very good idea, so that we'd have something drawn up for the next Monday's meeting, so it can be read. Okay, I like that. Anyone else? Anything else? Okay, so then we can move on to the budget workshop. Mr. Doyle?
Good evening, Board. I myself, with Stephanie Munoz, we're going to go over tonight's budget workshop. We're going to review the personnel and budget overview, how that process is going. So turn it over to Ms. Munoz.
Good evening. So our first slide is going to go over DEA local policy. So those of you who are newer to our process, it says the superintendent shall recommend an annual compensation plan for employees. Compensation will include wage, salary structures, stipends, benefits, incentives, and the recommendation shall support our district goals, the hiring and retaining of qualified employees. Then we go into our board shall approve the compensation plan to be used by the district. The board shall also determine the total compensation package for the superintendent, and the superintendent shall implement the compensation plan. What our personnel budget process looks like each year is we project roll-up numbers. So we work with finance, academics, and we determine how many students are in first grade This year, how many are going to be in second grade? And we roll each class up a grade level. We look at pathways for Goodnight and for Miller Middle School, and how many are going to be rolling up to the high school. Then we meet with departments, campus leaders. We discuss the needs of the campus, the needs of the departments, to determine how many allocations, how many FTEs, how many positions each department or campus will receive. Then we review allocations with the departments, with the campuses, to determine how is your staffing going to look like based on your students next year, and what are that true needs of the campus. We look at a formula just like this, or a document, and we project out for next year, working with Mr. Doyle and with Ms. Denise Garcia to determine how is that campus going to look for staffing and for student ratios. One of the exercises we do each year is we look at our market comparison. We want to see, what do our neighbors look like as far as teacher compensation? And so in front of you, purple is our district. Anything in green is paying more than San Marcos CISD. Anything in red, we are paying more for that year of service. So you have your 0, your 5, your 10, your 15, and your 20-year teachers. So we will look again at this with our TASB consultant and project out for next year to make sure that we are within market. One of our asks are to maintain competitive pay for teacher schedules. And so once that data is received, we'll bring it back to you and let you know where we, the district, are projecting in comparison to our peers. We also look at classified employees, so all of our hourly employees. What does San Marcos CISD pay for custodians, for instructional aides, for child nutrition, and for bus drivers? You'll see San Marcos in purple, and then all of the other neighbors that our custodians could possibly leave to, or child nutrition that surround San Marcos CISD. And through your competitive pay practices, we have maintained at the top of our area for these starting positions.
So right now, you can see two figures of how we're going to close 2023 as we project what that final allocation amount would be. We're looking at, with all the data sources, anywhere between 79 and 81 million. But as we look forward into next year, it's a very early prediction. We're looking at a slight increase between 82 and 83 million. So the figure that that the next few figures, next few slides are based on is that $83 million, if we're assuming that we receive 83 in revenue. What you can see right here is a trend over the last 7 years of our compensation and the adjustments that the board has moved on in terms of percent increase or dollar increase, which yields back to what Ms. Munoz was speaking of in terms of how our salary competes and looks to aligned to other districts. So what we have tonight, what we wanted to bring forth, were compensation options. So you'll see, there's a typo, it's 1, and it should be 2, I apologize. 1 is a no change, and 2 is a one-time payment. So as we talk about option 1, the no change, you can see right now what we assume is that our salary cost would be $72.8 million. We look also at maintenance and operation costs at 15.5. When you calculate those two together, we're assuming that the budget would need to be $88.3 million. That would leave a deficit of about $5.3 million. Now, with the adjustments, or going back to what Trustee Arellano was speaking of, we know that there are a lot of bills filed right now within the biennium, and excitingly enough, we know that there's a lot of finance talk, especially in terms of increasing the basic allotment number. But right now, we just don't know, and there's a little bit of uncertainty on that, right? So as we look at option 2, the one-time payment plan, this would allow the district to provide a one-time payment, incentive payment, if you will, to our employees to increase that retention piece. It would increase our salary costs to $75.5 million. Maintenance operation costs, again, 15.5, leaving a total figure of $91 million. That would leave roughly, if you're looking at an $83 million revenue income, of about $8 million deficit. Now, the reason being, we're looking at that one-time payment as an option until we conclude the biennium, until we actually have some concrete legislation in place. We feel that that's a little bit in a benefit. And there's always the option if you wanted to increase or maneuver salaries, that could be done after budget passes, September, October even. Oh, sorry.
So going back to the first option, we always like to show you all what our current salaries look like in the district if we just rolled over to next year. Just letting you see, this is what we call our zero plan. That means all salaries roll over to next year. And that's what this projection is right there. Like Mr. Doyle said, there's quite a few different things happening in the legislative session where there may be increases to teachers. And so as we kind of wait to see what happens throughout this summer, we wanted to bring forward one option, and that was an administrative one-time payment. We've done this the last couple years where we do a retention incentive and just kind of project out what that cost would look like. Again, if you all have other recommendations, we do want to take in that guidance, but we wanted to give you what a one-time payment would look like and what that final cost would be.
Ms. Villalpando?
I'd like to a little bit more clarification, because what I've heard from the places that we've been talking about, you know, what the legislature is going to do and all. But how does that work when we leave it at that? Let me see. The legislature, the talk is that they want to increase the salaries.
Yes.
Well, but they're only talking about teachers. And the criticism that I've heard from the past is that, yeah, they want to increase teachers' salaries, but then that's only for one biennium, right? And then the school will pick up that increase, right? Is that correct?
I believe 2 or 3 years ago, the legislative session passed, recommended a 2-tier option to pay teachers. Some districts went ahead and voted early what their pay they wanted it to look like, and then had to again bring forward to their board an additional option to increase pay. Because if we decide to increase teacher pay by 1 or 2%, but the legislative session says, no, this is what we want teachers to be paid, we're gonna have to increase teacher pay again. And what we decide and what we approve will not count, basically. And so that's why, Mr. Doyle, if you wanna.
Yes,
Yeah.
so that is in terms of if the state were to increase the basic allotment, right, of 60, right? Every student earns 160 is what one student earns, I'm sorry. If the basic allotment is increased, there is a statute that says that 30% of the added revenue has to go toward teacher pay and teacher increases. So it boils down to how much money the district would receive, and of that 30%.
So 30% is for teachers, but then there's also some left, so we could continue to.
Correct. Yes, ma'am.
have an increase. Okay.
And back to Ms. Munoz's point as well, any increase before would not count within that 30% if it were to go into law in, let's say, in June. If we were to put forth before, then we would have to come back with an additional increase.
So, Mr. Shanks? That's interesting.
So, we're already, looking at 6 million over budget. How much, on average, what is our salary savings from unfilled positions in a year?
We're looking around 2 to 2.5 million right now within vacancies.
So we'd still probably be over budget.
At this point, yes, sir.
And do y'all do projections like, 5 years out, 10 years out?
The difficulty with that is we don't necessarily know our revenue, right? for example, we were just talking about, we don't know if there's gonna be that increase in the basic allotment. We don't really know our total revenue from, with really looking outside of 2 years. It's very difficult because so many factors, but one example is our ADA is what determines the amount of revenue that we actually see. We're not based on enrollment figures, right? We do our projections on enrollment. We use demographic data to try to put something together to have a guide, if you will, but to actually have some concrete numbers, the difficulty is just, it makes it a challenge to do that.
There is also legislation that they're looking at switching to enrollment versus
Which me personally,
ADA.
I think that would be a huge benefit for all Texas school districts.
Okay. Mr. Redondo, you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
Mr.
thank you, Ms. Cantu. My first question is maybe for Mr. Doyle, maybe it's for Stephanie, or whoever wants to answer this. Last year's board approved raises, what was the average increase for teachers?
Percentage-wise,
Or can you give me a dollar amount? Is there like a
it was 1,700 per teacher.
per teacher? Okay, and that was based on the percentage that we gave them. The average raise was 1,700, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I know typically at this part in the process, people start requesting budget forecasts. So I'm going to throw mine out, at least right now. Like to see a 2% raise for administrators and all other professional staff. A $1,750 one-time stipend for teachers, and if the basic allotment is increased, then they would get whatever that raise is after the fact, and then a $1 per hour increase for all of our hourly employees.
Can I ask, you said a $1,750 teacher stipend? Are you referring to the one-time incentive, or are you talking about a raise?
I guess what is my understanding would be giving raises, the administrative recommendation would be to give everyone like a check, right? A one-off, and say like, if we can do it, we're going to do it. So I'm throwing something else out there that's similar to that, which would be like teachers are guaranteed their raise from last year. I mean, in a dollar amount, it's not reoccurring, but at least it stays static with last year's salary increase. And then when I tell you I'll do everything that I can to get basic allotment increase, I will, hoping that we can actually provide a reoccurring permanent salary increase at a later date, right? Because like I can read the tea leaves, it's going to be a lot of back and forth about, well, we can't do it and we don't know what we're going to do. And this is my option to try and prevent us from doing a one size fits all, nobody gets anything approach. With the fear that this teacher raise, if we give one, is going to come back and bite us because basic allotment got increased and the first raise doesn't count, and now we're spending even more money. And which again, I disagree with that line of reasoning fundamentally, but I'm just throwing out something that maybe will pass.
Okay.
I have a question. When you started off, you said that we could be having a deficit budget between 6 and 8 million. Did you say that, or did I hear wrong?
When you look at option one, when we just the rollover plan, assuming that we have a revenue stream of 83 million, compared to the total calculation of 88, that comes out to about $5.3 million deficit.
Okay, and so you're using ADA. If we were to use enrollment figures, have you done any figuring with that?
No, 88 million.
Oh,
would
88.
would be the total. I don't know, it's over here. If you look at that graphic, option one, that's a rollover plan.
Okay,
You can
I see it on that
ma'am.
page. And are we taking into consideration the Chapter 49 that we have to return when you're telling us that deficit?
Yes, that's already assumed within the revenue stream of 83 million. That's already taken out of there.
You've already figured that out, okay. Anyone else have questions?
Mejia, did you have a question? Ms. Halsey?
Yeah, I would recommend that if we go with a version of option 2 where we're doing a one-time stipend, and I do like the idea of tying it to retention because I know that we are struggling to keep teachers and staff, as everybody is. I would like us to make that as much as we can, but also perhaps we would pass it in 2 different batches, that we would do a first, maybe a half of it, and that we would pass this spring, and then we would save the remaining for later in the fall once the legislature had concluded its business and we have a better idea of what the financial picture looks like, so that if possible, we could either increase it at that point or we could change it to encompass the necessary guidelines for the teacher raises. Certainly, I'm all for giving the teachers and staff as much as we possibly can afford to do, but if we are being squeezed, then I think having more flexibility is better. So we're making those decisions intentionally and forward-looking rather than having to sort of do it backtracking.
So for the legislature to tell us if they're going to mandate raises for the teachers, about what time, until after the session's over in May, or would it be in the summer?
It would be, I would assume earliest June. That's, the session ends in May, so I would imagine if there's no special session afterwards, a June, but it's really a guess. We don't know.
So the most cost-efficient way would be to give a minimum amount depending on what they have, what the legislature mandates, and if it doesn't come through, then we could up ours. That's what y'all are thinking, right?
Correct, yes, ma'am. We could always amend in September,
Absolutely.
October even.
Because we want our staff to feel that we've recognized the need. Because of inflation, and it affects our hourly the same as it affects the teachers. I mean, the teachers and the bus drivers and custodians and cafeteria workers, they all shop at the same HEB. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that they're paying higher prices at the grocery store too. Mr. Shanks?
I guess I'm a little confused, because if we're expecting 83 million and we're talking about already without any extra money, no guarantee of any extra money coming in, we're already over 5.3 million of the budget.
Yeah.
And I would assume that our goal is to always to fill our positions first. So I guess I'm confused as to where this money is coming from in order to have somewhat of a balanced budget. Or do we just assume we're gonna carry over 2.25 roughly million in salary savings and use that for pay raises?
Yeah.
I'm just a little confused. The math doesn't work for me. If we're expecting 83 million in revenue, then, and we're already, based on the pay raises we gave last year, we're already going to be 5.3 million over budget, then until we know that there is going to be more money coming in, I don't know how we can take action on any salary raises at this point. That just does not, that does not make us good custodians of the taxpayers' money. And ultimately, that's one of our most important jobs as trustees.
Yes. Anyone else?
I mean, I think, so I'll just give you some background on this. In my experience on the board is that the initial projections are always very conservative, and depending on what the legislature does and doesn't do, the numbers change significantly. We're also required by the state education code to pass a budget before knowing what our numbers are from the state. So the fault really lies in some ways not with what the powers of this board are even capable of doing, right? So we are mandated to pass a tax rate, pass a budget, oftentimes before the biennium has even concluded, and the state budget office has told us what our income is going to be. So it is a little bit working in the dark, and that's a real structural issue, but it's one that the state of Texas continuously pushes on to school boards across the state. And leaves us really, at a loss, because ideally, yes, everybody wants a balanced budget, but in reality, it's oftentimes just not even something that we can feasibly do given the costs of our maintenance and security and personnel, so.
Taking into consideration all that you've told us, where does that leave that reserve amount that we are required by law to have 3 months of operating? Where does that leave us with our reserves?
I can get that calculation. I don't have it in front of me, but I can get that calculation based on these numbers. And I
Okay,
can
who
email
had
it.
their hand up? Mr. Shanks?
So roughly, because I know last year we passed a deficit budget also.
Yeah.
So how close are we this year estimating for the rest of the fiscal year? Are we going to have a deficit budget?
Yes, we passed that deficit budget.
Yes.
We've added to it, yes.
Yeah, so are we going to end up spending all of that money this year? I guess my question is, and in previous years, I understand that we've passed deficit budgets. So I'm just kind of going off what Ms. Halsey was saying is, so are we spending all that money when we do a deficit budget, or are we coming in under that? And what is kind of the overall expectation? Are we coming in 2% under, or are we digging into reserves every year to cover that money?
So we will not spend 100% of that deficit, but those are figures that I can get and email to the board and communicate that out in terms of what's that percentage that we typically put back in. But no, in answer to your question, we don't spend 100% of that deficit.
Okay.
And I think this year was really a different year considering how many vacancies that we carried. And this is a different year after our COVID pandemic, with teacher retention and teacher recruitment. And so when you hear us talk about the teacher residency program, that we are hiring more Texas State teachers, that is going to help us. It's going to strengthen our pipeline, but we carried a lot of vacancies this year that we normally do not. So Mr. Doyle said 2.5 in vacancies. That's not a normal return that we have. So hopefully we'll be able to minimize our teacher vacancies and be fully staffed for next year.
Which will cost closer to the amount
Right.
that we're projecting for
It's just-
spending.
This year is a hard projection where you're asking how much do we typically put back, because this year was different.
Yeah, and I don't need like exact numbers. If you could just estimate a percentage, on average for the last 5 years, we've had a deficit budget, and on average we've put 1% back. I'm not looking for exact numbers, because with these numbers.
Yeah, on average, we've actually put money back into the reserve fund over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. I think almost every year except potentially one, and that again has in part to do with the when we find out the numbers from the county in terms of when they take the final measurements of the tax base and how much they're changing that percentage to what the district gets versus what the district has to return, and now that we're into recapture, and the fact that they changed the financial system at the state level during the last biennium, and we're still playing catch up to try to figure out how that meets out in terms of the scheduling. It's, it seems like it should be really straightforward, and it's infuriatingly not. And then once it becomes sort of, here's the direct AB, somebody changes something, and it becomes again like the system that is very difficult to predict with any sort of accuracy, is what my experience has been.
Yes. Mr. Redondo? Mr. Redondo?
Thank you, Ms. Cantu. So I guess my question is, staff
We've got
presented a preliminary budget projection when it came to raises. They've referenced their tentative plan. I think I heard staff open the door to trustee request, and so I've made one. I'm happy to stay here all night with y'all and lobby back and forth on what we should do, what we can't do, what we're obligated to do. But it's my understanding we're not voting on this tonight. So I guess my question is, if there's anyone on that dais who, do y'all want to see a proposal that doesn't give raises? Because then we need to ask for that, right? Or somebody does. Because I think that's where we are in this budget formation process, right? People are asking questions related to not giving raises. So can we just go ahead and make that one of the proposals then that staff presents? I'm not going to vote for it, but I mean, or we can stay here all night and talk about why we should or should not or can't give raises.
I'm assuming that this
We're not
presentation
through.
makes that one of the,
We're not through with the presentation. If we could let them finish, and then we can still have questions after they get done.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like we're starting to like lobby each other on what we should or shouldn't do, which I don't think we're in that part of the
No,
process.
I don't
yet,
think it's
right?
time to lobby with each other. I think it's
Yeah.
time to let them finish their presentation.
And
And
I'm sorry
ask
if it
questions.
sounded
We
like
have
I
to
was
ask
lobbying.
questions.
I'm just trying to understand the full process. I came in May last year, so I missed this portion
I said,
of it. So
you missed the process last year.
I'm learning as I go.
And the process has to be in the spring, and there's still so many question marks. So if you,
Sensing our frustration, Mr. Shanks.
if you can continue, Mr. Doyle.
Okay. For the next portion, where Andrew Fernandez, he's going to talk a little bit about rezoning some of our schools.
Okay.
All right, good evening, board. So change of direction in a sense, but staying on the same street. And since we're talking about streets, we're going to talk about district streets. So looking at the numbers for next year in regards to allocations for campuses. So we base our allocations on the number of students. So if we move exactly how we're projected for next year, Miller Middle School would have 1,100 students, and Goodnight would have 800 students. So we went to our demographer and said, what can we do to even out the schools? And so we threw out the idea of moving in Rodriguez entirely over to Goodnight, and then it flipped the numbers. So if we made Rodriguez a feeder of Goodnight, Goodnight would have 1,100 kids next year, and Miller would have 800. So we went back to our demographer, and we said, what else can we do? So what we can do is, let me go up to the screen. I'll show you the two sections of Rodriguez that we will move over. The recommendation from our demographer is to move these two sections over to the Bowie zone. Our Vanna White, Mr. James Navarez, will help us. So this triangle area right here, it's currently zoned to Rodriguez, where Mission Trail Apartments is now located. So when we ran these numbers, 4 years ago, before Rodriguez was in existence, Mission Trail Apartments was not there. And then the subdivision behind the Mission Trail Apartments, which is Cottonwood Parkway and Cordero Drive. And so that subdivision right there, we would move this subdivision to the Bowie subdivision, or the Bowie zone. And then the new apartments where Rattler Stadium is. So you literally look outside the window of those apartment complexes and you see Bowie Elementary. But again, these apartment complexes weren't there when we rezoned Rodriguez. So what we're recommending is to move these sections over to the Bowie boundary. And so what that would do to our numbers, this would be our projection for next year. So more even. Goodnight would have roughly around 942 students, Miller 971. Bowie Elementary would go to around 604, and Rodriguez Elementary would go to 515. So these numbers, we're also putting into effect the grandfather role. So of course we're gonna have some Rodriguez students who are currently Rodriguez students, but they're living in those two patches. We would give them the opportunity to stay at Rodriguez if they would like, but they have to provide their own transportation since their two subdivisions are now zoned to Bowie. If they decide to go to Bowie, of course we can provide that transportation, but if they want to stay at Rodriguez, then they must provide their own transportation. So this was a recommendation by our demographer. The projections for Rodriguez and Bowie would look really strong. So over the next 3 to 4 years, or 3 to 6 years, we'll see those two schools grow tremendously. So according to our demographer, that's where the most growth is going to happen, is Bowie and Rodriguez. So we'll probably come to you in 3 or 4 years if we have to go out for another bond and talk about boundary changes again. So it's a Band-Aid effect, but it's because our growth is it's coming. So it's a good thing, but this is our recommendation for next year. We will start communicating this with families as soon as tomorrow. So we're working on receiving the list of students, contacting them, and then giving them their options. You can, of course, transfer over to Bowie, and we'll provide transportation, or stay at Rodriguez and provide your own transportation. And we'll have that communication from the district level, but we'll also support the campuses on the individual communication with the families.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
On these projected numbers, is there a way to have a capacity number? I mean, will the 942 or the 971, would that put them at what percentage capacity?
So,
Do you have those capacity numbers at all?
yes, our demographer has given those to us, and both schools, Goodnight and Miller, our rough capacity is around 1,100.
1,100?
Mhm.
And what about the elementaries?
So, for Bowie, capacity according to our demographer is right around 728. And for Rodriguez, it's 660.
660?
Yes, ma'am. So capacity-wise, this gives us a few years for both campuses.
so
Well, for all 4 campuses. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah,
Hal-
I have a
Ms. Halsey?
question. Have you determined a transportation plan yet for those 2 complexes if we shift them to Bowie? Because even though they are very close to Bowie, which I think makes sense, those are major highways that would need to be crossed. So we would bus from both those complexes? Okay.
Yes, Mr. Shields said actually would make the transportation a little easier for them.
Super, thanks.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, Mr. Shields, to give him huge kudos. In these demographer meetings, he knows where every street is, every back road, whether it's dirt road, asphalt, cement, whatever type of road it is. Mr. Shields is very well aware of this community in such a short amount of time. So truly, kudos to him for being so helpful throughout this process.
It's just so Mr. Shields is our transportation director.
Yes, our transportation director, Mr. Shields. He knows
Thank you.
these streets better than I have, and I've been here 6 years, so. Hope that's not taken against me, but.
Anyone else?
All right.
So in conclusion, I just want to remind everybody of the next steps. When we look out into May, we do have a May 1 special call board meeting that we can bring some further data to the board to review. May 15th, that's the date that we'll set the public hearing date for the tax rate and the budget. Remember, it's a public hearing. We got to make sure that we announce that. We have a special call board meeting in June 5th if we need to take any items up for discussion there. And then finally, June 19th is our the regularly scheduled board meeting in which we have to hold public hearings for the tax rate and set the budget and approve the budget.
Questions? Anyone? Good presentation, Mr. Doyle. And Stephanie, good presentation, y'all.
For your patience. No, I'm excited.
I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we adjourn.
Motion made by Ms. Villapando, second Ms. Mejia, that we adjourn. All in favor, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I don't know, I can't see Mr. Arredondo anymore. See if he's there.
Oh, wow.
Is he gone? Okay.
My video is on.
5-0, we adjourn. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for working so hard on this. Mr. Arredondo, did he raise your hand? Okay, so I don't know if you're gonna write 5-0 or 6-0.
I did 5 zeros.
You did?
That's what you call it.
Yeah, I called a 5-0.